Welcome to the holiday console sales season of 1991, when the so-called console war between the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis began in earnest. In North America, Nintendo had reigned supreme since the mid-80s, thanks to the incredible popularity of the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Super Mario Bros. But Sega had launched not one, but two different consoles in an attempt to dethrone Nintendo, but neither could make so much as a dent in the armor of the juggernaut from Kyoto. That all changed in 1991, when Sega of America's new president, Tom Kalinske, dropped the price of the Sega Genesis to $150 and threw in a copy of the brand new Sonic the Hedgehog with every console. This move caused the 2-year-old Genesis to start flying off the shelves, becoming for the first time one of the hottest toys of the Christmas season. But Santa's elves are going to have to kick it into high gear, because in August of 1991, Nintendo unleashed their own 16-bit behemoth upon North America. The Super Nintendo promised to do everything the normal Nintendo did, but now with even more Nintendo power. Except that it wasn't backward compatible with existing NES games, and didn't come with a light gun, and cost $200 in 1991, or $50 more than the Genesis. And for some reason, parents all across America thought it was a scam. I mean, didn't they just buy a Nintendo? Why now did they have to buy a Super Nintendo?
Video game industry is hotter than ever this season, and one good reason? Nintendo has introduced some hot new toys. But have things gone a bit too far? This evening, Ken Shockney wraps up a special report on Video Mania.
So that's the new Super Nintendo Entertainment System.
What about it?
They say it has 16-bit technology, whatever that means.
Oh, I see. What else do they say?
That it has 3D graphics and digital stereo sound, and that Super Mario World is included.
Okay, we'll get it for them.
So, are you convinced? Wow, getting your mom to talk to your dad for you? Looks like Santa's gonna have to fill this kid's stocking full of baby food. 'Cause, you know, he's a big wimpy baby. And Santa don't like that. Anyway, despite some skepticism from our boomer parents, the Super Nintendo launched alongside some seriously great games, including a brand new Super Mario game, a brand new Castlevania game, a brand new game, this weird thing, and a port of the late 80s hit Sim City. For reasons? But in the meantime, the Sega Genesis was on fire, and Sonic the Hedgehog had rapidly taken hold of impressionable, easily manipulated brains. This looks cool. But which console was actually better? I know they're both good, but if you could have asked Santa Claus, or Judas Maccabee, or Milana Karenga, or your salty dad, alright, for one video game console the Christmas of 1991, which one was it gonna be? Because unless your parents were divorced, you sure as hell weren't getting two. On the one hand, the Genesis was $50 cheaper, and came with the coolest game of the year. But on the other hand, the Super Nintendo had solid brand recognition, and a new Mario game that was almost guaranteed to be great. The best decision really was going to come down to all the other games. Which console in 1991 had the best games on the store shelves? So let's examine some of the best games that would have been readily available for both the Sega Genesis and the new Super Nintendo. Then we'll really know who got the best Christmas console, that fateful Christmas, and/or Hanukkah, of 1991. Because we all know it wasn't this poor bastard. Getting a TurboGrafx 16 in 1991 would be like getting a dead puppy. Hold on to that dead puppy, Timmy. In 30 years, it'll be worth thousands in a bloated speculator's market. You'll finally be able to pay back college. Oh, and Timmy, trust me, don't go to college. So hop on board my magical time-traveling Christmas sleigh, and we'll go back to the past to play games that really kicked ass across 11 different popular categories, including racers, JRPGs, space shooters, also called shmups, football, action platformers, PC games on consoles, run and guns, action RPGs, beat-em-ups, games that defy classification, and of course, we'll compare the mascots. Which would you rather have under your 1991 Christmas tree? The time to find out is now. Round 1. Racing games. The Super Nintendo launched with F-Zero, a sometimes nauseatingly fast, futuristic racer developed by Nintendo EAD, the same team that was behind Mario and Zelda. The Sega Genesis, on the other hand, had Road Rash by Electronic Arts, a Gen X super extreme motorcycle racer that encourages you to violently kick your opponents off their bikes while you outrun the cops. Do the dudes! Whoa! Neither game allows for two-player simultaneous co-op, So right off the bat, these are both a little disappointing. But which is better? F-Zero very effectively demonstrates the technological prowess of the Super Nintendo, especially the amazing Mode 7 scaling effect, which endowed F-Zero with a quasi-3D racetrack that would remain the best produced in the console's lifespan. The game was heavily featured in commercials and magazines at the time, and for good reason. It was legitimately one of the best racing games ever developed for a home console at the time of its release in August of 1991. The scrolling was super smooth and the sense of speed was intense. Road Rash, on the other hand, was also widely featured in print ads and got rave reviews from game critics. Like F-Zero, the game scrolls astonishingly fast for a Sega Genesis game, but the graphics are also really choppy compared to F-Zero, and that hinders gameplay in a game with so many hazards you need to visually identify and avoid. You can hit oncoming traffic and survive. You can also run around off your bike, which is pretty funny. As you win races, you earn money that lets you buy better bikes for future races. But all of the races take place in a handful of samey western levels. If I'm being honest here, the future world of F-Zero looks even blander. However, F-Zero also offers far more gameplay variety due to each track playing like its own event, with unique characteristics and quirks that must be mastered in order to progress. F-Zero also makes good use of the Super Nintendo's excellent controller, utilizing the innovative shoulder buttons to allow you to shift your racer during hard turns. There's also a turbo button and the option to choose from 4 different vehicles right from the start. Add to that an outstanding soundtrack that sticks with the all-time greats, and it's clear to me that the winner of this race is F-Zero. The winner of round 1? Nintendo. Round 2. Sports games. People often credit Electronic Arts with popularizing sports games, and no EA sports game is as popular as their endless series of John Madden football sims, which got their start as a statistics-heavy strategy game for the Apple II way back in 1988. In 1990, the game was completely remade for the Sega Genesis, with drastic graphical improvements and an increased emphasis on arcade-style play that made the game one of the first true hits for the struggling console. A sequel was released just in time for the Christmas of 1991 called, oddly enough, Madden 92, kicking off a tradition of naming sports games the same way they named cars the next year. Madden 92 was a big improvement over the original. Now you could play as all 28 NFL teams, though not officially. There were now weather conditions on the field, and you now had the option to play with a friend on the same team. But best of all, if you destroyed the quarterback, an ambulance will rush the field and run over everyone in its way. It's bizarre, it's distasteful, and of course, it's hilarious. So what did the Super Nintendo have to counter this, that fateful first Christmas in North America? They got a unique version of John Madden Football from the previous year, which suffered from a really bad frame rate issue for some reason. John Madden 92 on the Sega Genesis is definitely a lot smoother to look at and play, and it let you play in the snow. No snow on a Super Nintendo at Christmas time? And of course no ambulance driving through the players. While Madden 92 for the Genesis is regarded by many as a Hall of Famer, no one really cares for the stuttering and choppy gameplay of Madden for the Super Nintendo. The winner this round for having the best football game is the Sega Genesis. Round 3. JRPGs. Alright jocks, hit the showers! It's time for the nerds to talk about RPGs. In November of 1991, Squaresoft released Final Fantasy II in North America, the sequel to Final Fantasy on the NES that actually turned out to be the sequel to 2 sequels that were never released in North America, which means in Japan this is actually Final Fantasy IV. But in many ways, this may as well be the first Final Fantasy for all the series firsts this game introduces. It's the first Final Fantasy with a detailed story and fully fleshed out characters. It introduced the active time battle system that was meant to make turn-based combat more engaging. And for English-speaking gamers, Final Fantasy II was their first encounter with the iconic chocobos and that catchy chocobo music. Sega, on the other hand, had Phantasy Star 3 to offer the Christmas of 1991, the latest entry in their flagship RPG series that originated on the Master System back in 1987. While Final Fantasy II was the first Final Fantasy to charm fans of the series, Phantasy Star 3 was the first Phantasy Star game to disappoint its fans. Fans were especially disappointed in the drab medieval fantasy look the game adopted. While it is eventually revealed that the medieval world is actually built upon the ruins of a futuristic dead civilization, the game's appearance and tone remain throughout. Every town looks the same, and so do all the futuristic high-tech dungeons. What Phantasy Star 3 lacked in depth and presentation, it attempted to make up for in terms of its giant scope, containing not one but 3 entire adventures featuring 3 different protagonists across 3 different generations of gameplay. At the end of the first and second section of the game, you're asked to choose a wife, which will determine who you play as next and lead to one of the game's 4 possible endings. This is an amazing idea that is never actualized in a game with very few in-game events, little to no dialogue, no character development, and almost no NPCs to interact with. The universe of Phantasy Star 3 is practically uninhabited, and therefore the epic timeline is equally hollow. What's left is a bare-bones Dragon Quest clone with endless random battles and mindless grinding. Final Fantasy II for the Super Nintendo, on the other hand, is rich with characters and meaningful story development that motivates the player to grind out the next section of the game. And while active time battles are little more than an attempt to make menu-driven turn-based combat slightly less boring by simply forcing the player to make rushed decisions, it is indeed a step up from the mindless grinding of most early RPGs. Add to that a stellar soundtrack by Nobuo Uematsu and a world to explore with much more life and variety, and we find that Final Fantasy II is the clear winner here. It's the best RPG in 1991 by a wide margin. Point goes to the Super Nintendo. Round 4, Shmups. Boy, there were a lot of shooters released in 1991, even on the Super Nintendo, which is a console that supposedly lacked shooters. There were 5 shooters released on the Super Nintendo between August and December of 1991, if we count Hyperzone, an often overlooked rail shooter developed by HAL Laboratories. Many people comment on the fact that Hyperzone looks a lot like F-Zero, which might explain why this game faded into obscurity so quickly, given the choice between this and the acclaimed F-Zero, but speed isn't really a factor in this game at all. Shooting everything is, and it actually plays a lot more like Sega's Space Harrier arcade game. The music is good and the graphics scroll fairly well for a game like this, especially so early in the Super Nintendo's lifespan. Hyperzone is basically a hidden gem. The best shooter on the Super Nintendo in 1991, however, was probably Gradius 3, an impressive launch title that was kept from true greatness by the presence of a lot of unfortunate slowdown from time to time. I've always loved the upgrade system in Gradius. There's nothing quite like filling the screen with laser firing options. And speaking of options, Gradius 3 lets you customize the power-up system, which adds a surprising amount of depth and replayability. The Super Nintendo also had Super R-Type, a remixed version of R-Type 2 that's infamous for its difficulty, since the game employs no checkpoints. If you die in a level, you go back to the start of the level. This is a must-play for fans of R-Type, but most people will probably lose their minds trying to play it. The Super Nintendo also was home to a port of Capcom's Area 88, which was renamed the UN Squadron. Reducing the redundancy inherent in the genre, UN Squadron allowed you to choose from multiple characters, to purchase and customize planes between levels, and to even choose which levels you'd like to play, to a degree. This game was quite unique at the time, and it's quite fun. Darius Twin was the other shooter released for the Super Nintendo in 1991. This is an above-average shooter with smooth, fast-paced gameplay that actually allowed for 2-player simultaneous co-op. I could never get into the weird art style and the fishy theme of these Darius games, but as far as Darius goes, this is a pretty good entry. And speaking of pretty good Darius games, the Sega Genesis was traditionally home to a wide variety of excellent shooters, and 1991 was no exception. Included in the lineup that year was Sagaya, which is actually a port of Darius 2. This is a really fun and action-packed shooter, but sadly, unlike Darius Twin on the Super Nintendo, this one is only 1 player. Then there's Gyarados, which might be the best game ever developed by Nihon Telenet, and it was a very well-regarded, tough-as-nails shooter for a hardcore faction. Professional gamer Jamie Bunker says that Gyarados is #1. Unfortunately, the game has some balance issues and isn't nearly as polished as the arcade games that inspired it, but regardless, this would have been a serious hit for any fan of the genre back in 1991. One of my personal favorite shooters on the Genesis is Airbuster. I prefer the TurboGrafx-16 version, but this is still really good with dynamic levels full of fun surprises, such as this awesome speed run through twisting narrow passageways. When you get it right, it's quite a rush. Airbuster is a very creative game, but it's also really short. However, the high difficulty will make this roughly 25-minute long game seem a lot longer than it really is. The Genesis also had Musha by Compile, which is legitimately one of the best games on the Genesis, and since then has become something of a collector's item, to say the least. Instead of a run-of-the-mill spaceship, you control a mech that can be powered up in a wide variety of ways depending upon a combination of power-ups. You also have control of your attack pattern, which you can toggle through as you play. Like all Compile shooters, the action is intense and frantic, and while the game starts off fairly easy, it's just long enough to give you a taste of being a badass. Not all shooters are this courteous. And finally, rounding out this 5-on-5 shmup mega showdown is Troubleshooter by Vic Tokai, which is obviously inspired by the Dirty Pair anime series and allows you to control not one but two heroines at the same time. The blonde is your main girl, while the brunette covers your rear, but you can switch her to the front to dish out double damage whenever you desire. This game is very fun and seems to relish surprising the player, like this epic part where some dude you rescue joins in on the action, giving you partial control of 3 sprites at the same time. No one really bought this game back in 1991, possibly because of this cover art, but today this and the sequel are among the most popular games on the console. So obviously there were a ton of great shmups released in 1991, it's actually overwhelming. And honestly, when I compare the shooters for the Super Nintendo and the Genesis, at this particular point in time, I see no clear winner. Both sides are pretty great. This is a tie, a point to both the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. So far, Nintendo's ahead by a point. So let's talk about one of the most popular genres, side-scrolling action platformers. We'll hold off on talking about the mascots. Those are so important that they merit their own category. And once again, both the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis would have had a lot of very compelling games to consider going into the Christmas sales season of 1991. A launch game for the Super Nintendo was ActRaiser, a unique game that attempted to combine platforming action with lengthy overhead simulation portions that let you play as God. Unfortunately, ActRaiser doesn't really do justice to either genre. The action portions feature big, colorful sprites, but they're also fairly generic and short, and the controls are really stiff. But most playtime is actually spent in the overhead simulation portions, which are highly repetitive, require little strategic thinking, and feature tedious, clunky menus for doing everything. Today people swear this is awesome, but I think it's just okay. A much better game is the astonishingly beautiful Super Ghouls and Ghosts by Capcom, a game custom made for the Super Nintendo that's still marred by less than acceptable levels of slowdown. The difficulty of this game, as with all of the games in the Ghosts and Goblins series, is treacherous and will put most people off immediately. Even if you spend hours memorizing this game's amazing levels, you'd be hard-pressed to actually beat it, considering the fact that you have to do it twice and end the game equipped with a special weapon that's hard to get and almost impossible to keep. Super Ghouls and Ghosts has its fans, but outside of the graphics, most people will not like this. Super Castlevania 4, on the other hand, is probably the best non-Mario platformer released for the Super Nintendo in 1991, and up until this point it was probably the best Castlevania game ever made. Unlike ActRaiser, the controls are quite smooth, and while the level designs are never quite as beautiful or dynamic as Super Ghouls and Ghosts, it does get pretty darn close in certain areas. Plus, this game's playability is much more fair. It might very well be the easiest Castlevania game ever made until Symphony of the Night. Super Castlevania 4 is also a fairly lengthy adventure that takes you from the periphery of Dracula's castle to underground caves, and of course a lengthy fight through Dracula's castle itself. In 1991, this was definitely one of the best games on the Super Nintendo. And a game released just in time for Christmas of 1991 that's not one of the best games on the Super Nintendo was Home Alone. Just one of many Home Alone games that were made in the wake of the surprise mega success of the movie. There are a lot of funny videos on YouTube that dump on this game, but it's really not all that bad. It's just average. It's a simple treasure hunter with simple platforming mechanics. Avoid the wet bandits and dump your rich family's hidden valuables down in the basement for safekeeping. It's not Game of the Year, but it's definitely not the worst game either. The Sega Genesis, on the other hand, was no stranger to excellent action platforming games. Of course, Sega's flagship series in this genre is Shinobi, and 1991 did not disappoint with a home port of Shadow Dancer that was superior to the arcade game in every single way. Ditching the changes made to gameplay by the Revenge of Shinobi from the previous year, Shadow Dancer is a throwback to the original Shinobi arcade game with huge jumps, infinite throwing stars, close range melee attacks, hostage rescuing, ninja magic on every stage, and now you have a pet dog that knows ninjutsu. I really love this strange and challenging action game set in a post-apocalyptic New York City, but it's also quite short. It can be beaten in roughly 30 minutes. Valis 3 was also released for the Sega Genesis in 1991. Valis is a long-running game series about beautiful Japanese heroines more or less out of a typical anime TV show. The games also play very closely to Castlevania, especially Valis 3, which included the ability to swap characters like Castlevania 3 on the NES. It's a tad unpolished, but the soundtrack is phenomenal. One of my all-time favorite Sega Genesis games that not too many people talk about is 1991's Decap Attack by Vic Tokai, the makers of Troubleshooter. Both games in fact share some pieces of music and sound effects. Decap Attack is a zany, often surprising action platformer starring a decapitated monster that throws his skull as a projectile weapon. The levels are big and fun to explore, but a lot of people are turned off by the momentum-based mechanics that require you to gain speed for jumps, and the strange art style. The item system is also really cryptic for first-time players. But probably the best Sega Genesis platformer for the Christmas of 1991 was Quackshot starring Donald Duck, the sequel to Sega's popular Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse. The graphical presentation here is phenomenal. It's like playing an episode of DuckTales. Indeed, many of the main characters from that series appear in Quackshot, and like DuckTales, this game is all about exploration and adventure. There are 9 different areas to explore, and many will require you to revisit them as Donald finds new items and abilities that allow him to get to places he couldn't before. At times, the platforming is a little slow and stiff, but with so much charm and so much to see and explore, this is easily my favorite action platformer released in 1991. This is going to be very controversial given how much nostalgia surrounds both Super Ghouls and Ghosts and Castlevania 4, but genuinely, I think the Sega Genesis lineup is significantly better. Quackshot in particular is a standout game. In 1991, the Sega Genesis had the better action platformers to choose from. Looks like we have a tie. Round 6. Beatemups. One of the best things going for the Super Nintendo in 1991 was the fact that it was widely known that the console was receiving an exclusive home port of Capcom's arcade hit, Final Fight. And boy did we love Final Fight with its huge character sprites, pro wrestling moves, Andre the Giant, and bone-crushing graphics. In my hometown of El Paso, Texas, this was easily the most popular arcade game around until Capcom outdid themselves with Street Fighter II. The Super Nintendo version was released on September of 1991, just days after the console's launch, and at first glance it appeared to be an amazing achievement. It looked and played just like the arcade game, but it didn't take long to realize that a whole bunch of stuff was missing. Worst of all, it was missing one of the game's playable characters, a fan favorite called Guy. And just to rub salt into the wounds, it turned out that there was no two-player mode, an unforgivable omission in a genre that largely depends on multiplayer for the best experience. Final Fight on Super Nintendo looked good, but turned out to be one of the most disappointing games of the year. Meanwhile, in order to compete with Nintendo's exclusive hold on the Final Fight license, Sega had developed their own urban beat-em-up called Streets of Rage. At first glance, the tiny sprites of Streets of Rage and the diminished color palette of the Sega Genesis seemed like it'd be no match for the Super Nintendo, but it's after playing both games side by side that one realizes that Streets of Rage is the superior game. It had faster, more satisfying gameplay, featured two-player action, and thanks to Yuzo Koshiro, had one of the greatest video game soundtracks of all time. Though Final Fight was still a bestseller in 1991, there's no doubt that it was a disappointment, to about the same degree that Sega's excellent Streets of Rage was a big surprise, and one of the best games of the year. This time it's no contest, the point goes to Sega. Round 7. PC ports. The divide between console and PC gaming in 1991 was wide indeed, but a few PC games made it to the consoles that were worth playing. Of course, the Super Nintendo launched with the special edition of the classic SimCity that was developed internally by Nintendo and specifically for their new console. Up until SimCity 2000 was released a couple years later, this was the best version of SimCity ever made. SimCity is, of course, a fairly complicated city building and city management simulator, originally released on PCs in 1989. Nintendo breaks through the stiff learning curve by including a well-organized and approachable tutorial mode, as well as the option to consult an in-game advisor called Dr. Wright. The menus are well organized and the controls, despite the absence of a mouse and keyboard, are precise and effective. Nintendo also added tons of personal little touches, including overhauled graphics and sound, changing seasons, and Nintendo branded elements like a giant rampaging Bowser being one of the game's hazards. But as good as this is, this very slow-paced and relaxing game doesn't necessarily appeal to everybody. On the other hand, the Sega Genesis had a port of Star Control, a game that had debuted on Amiga and DOS-based computers the year prior, and boy was this game an instant classic. Star Control is part interplanetary war sim, heavily influenced by Star Trek, and part one-on-one space combat game rooted in the same gameplay mechanics as Space War or Asteroids.
You got asteroids?
No, but my dad does. Can't even sit on the toilet some days.
These one-on-one action-based battles are the real star of the game, which allows you to skip the Sims aspects entirely and just engage in endless battles with the game's wide variety of human and alien spacecraft. Best of all, Star Control supports two-player simultaneous action, which is great fun. The full Star Control game experience includes managing and moving units across this 3D map of a galaxy. Most of your time is spent here, doing resource management and the like, and only occasionally will you be drawn into battles. It's a tricky game to master, but with practice you'll eventually discover that there is a deep game with over a dozen different modes and scenarios that can keep you busy pretty much forever. The replay value here is insane. That being said, aesthetically, Star Control is bare bones. It's got a few basic sound effects and the very bare minimum of graphical content, but that doesn't stop this from being a great game. Both SimCity for the Super Nintendo and Star Control for the Genesis are fantastic. This is another tie. Round 8. Run and Guns. In the late 80s and early 90s, run-and-gun action games were a big draw. Contra on the NES was one of those games you saw in virtually every kid's NES collection. That's why it's a shame the Super Nintendo had nothing to offer from this genre the Christmas of 1991. Sega, on the other hand, had two games. Midnight Resistance was a home port of a Data East arcade game that delivers a short but thrilling action game with tons of firepower, explosions, and one of the best soundtracks on the Sega Genesis. It's not quite Contra, but in my own crazy way I prefer this gaudy, mulleted masterpiece of 80s cheese over any of the popular Contra games any day. And then there's Mercs, an excellent home port of Capcom's arcade sequel to Commando that was actually developed by Sega. Mercs on the Genesis wasn't quite as impressive as the 3-player arcade game, but it offered a ton more content by giving players the choice of playing either the arcade game or an original mode with completely remixed levels and brand new game mechanics that emphasized more exploration and some light RPG elements, letting you power up one of a group of different soldiers, each with their own special weapon, color scheme, and stupid name that sounds something like from American Gladiators. Original mode is essentially a completely new game, and in my opinion, it's the superior game. It even had a map between levels indicating your progress. Unfortunately, in spite of all the new content, Mercs lacked a second or third player option, keeping the game from reaching true glory. But at the very least, Sega showed up to the dance. Twice. Nintendo had nothing comparable to offer the Christmas of 1991. Point goes to Sega. Round 9. Action RPGs. We've talked about JRPGs, yes, but what about action RPGs? Obviously everyone knows the Super Nintendo for The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, considered by many to be the greatest game of the 16-bit era. But during the Christmas sales season of 1991, Link wasn't an option yet, so what did kids hope for under the tree if they got a Super Nintendo? All Nintendo had to offer as far as action RPGs go was a port of a Japanese PC game called Lagoon. At first, Lagoon appears to be rather charming with animated cutscenes and great music. The graphics in this town here aren't too shabby for 1991, but once the action finally starts, boy, this game just dies. Your sword attack, its range, its animation, its lack of proper sound effects, it's absolutely pathetic. And this isn't just an aesthetic deficiency, but it renders the game virtually unplayable. The Genesis, on the other hand, at the very least, had Ys 3, a side-scrolling action RPG that features a lot of fast-paced sword-swinging action and loads of tedious grinding. Like Lagoon, the music in this game is great. In fact, it's fantastic. But the best part is that swinging your sword, though sometimes marred by questionable hit detection, is actually pretty fun this time around. And though the graphics are relegated to this tiny little box, they're much more creative and colorful compared to Lagoon. Both games represent short and relatively simple adventures, but only Ys 3 on the Sega Genesis is actually any fun to play. If you were looking for some sword swinging adventuring, then the Sega Genesis was for you, the Christmas of 1991. Point goes to the Sega Genesis. Round 10. Miscellaneous games. We've looked at 9 of the most popular genres in 1991, except for puzzle and fighting games, neither being categories for games you'd actually want to play. However, both consoles had big hits in 1991 that defy easy categorization, so we'll pit them against each other and see which weirdo wins. One of the Super Nintendo launch games is Pilot Wings by Nintendo. Remember how everyone hates Superman 64 because it forced you to fly through boring rings? Well, Pilot Wings is that, but with a little red propeller plane instead of the Man of Steel. This game is widely praised, but I think it's boring. It's the kind of game that makes parents buy while their children cry. People will defend Pilot Wings. They say it's relaxing, but that's just a euphemism for boring. If I wanted to relax, I wouldn't be playing video games. I'd go to sleep. The graphics for the time were admittedly very interesting. Not good or anything, the game looked as awful back then as it does now, but it's like when you get Doom to play on a Texas Instruments graphing calculator. At the very least, it's neato. Sega, on the other hand, had Toe Jam and Earl, which is a very unique take on a roguelike, with its procedurally generated isometric world to explore and loot. Two rapping aliens from the planet Funkatron have crashed their spaceship on a wacky Nickelodeon version of Earth that's comprised of 25 ascending flat plateaus stacked one on top of the other. Now they have to explore these 25 floating levels in order to find all of the pieces of their spaceship and go home. To do so successfully, they'll need to gather presents scattered around the world that will help them survive Earth's many hostile inhabitants, including giant hamster balls and hula girls. Some presents are useful, while others are diabolically self-destructive. Either way, it's quite amusing. But what really makes this deep and creative game really great is the two-player simultaneous co-op. It really is the definitive way to play it, even if you've never managed to beat it. I guess you could say that this game is just really relaxing. Toe Jam and Earl was one of the best Sega Genesis games of 1991, and it's still incredibly fun to this very day. That can't be said for the horrendously dated pseudo 3D graphics of Pilot Wings. Point goes to Sega. Final round. The mascots. Okay, so far the Sega Genesis has really handed the Super Nintendo its ass. That only makes sense given the fact that the Super Nintendo had only been on store shelves for a few months before Christmas. Sega had years on the console, as well as a special relationship with companies like Electronic Arts and Telenet. But let's be real, to consumers in 1991, this first epic Christmas showdown between Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis was really a battle between two superstar games, Super Mario World and Sega's brand new mascot, Sonic the Hedgehog, both of which were pack-in games included with every console. These were the true system sellers, as they say. Both companies were facing unique challenges and had unique advantages. Nintendo was coming off the success established by Mario on the NES, especially the universally loved Super Mario Bros. 3, possibly the greatest game ever made up until that point. Brand recognition was plainly in Nintendo's favor, but they were also faced with the daunting task of topping what already represented the pinnacle of the industry. If Nintendo was going to sell a skeptical and somewhat irritated America on buying yet another Nintendo, it was absolutely essential that Super Mario World was some kind of freaking Christmas miracle. Sega, on the other hand, had novelty on their side, with a legitimately cool character that was liberated of the burden of impossibly high expectations. As long as Sonic the Hedgehog was good, it was gonna make consumers feel justified in moving on to something different than Nintendo.
He has a Game Boy, and now he has the Nintendo, and now he'd have to have another unit just for that one game. It doesn't seem right.
There's no question now that Nintendo has really taken off and millions of fans are waiting for the next game, that parents might be upset because the new game is going to cost twice as much. But nevertheless, there is still a real interest in Super Nintendo. This store, in fact, has a waiting list, and they haven't even gotten the game in yet.
So which was better? My first impression of Super Mario World was that it was a putridly saccharine baby toy. Every aesthetic decision in this game is bewilderingly infantile. The music sounds like nursery rhymes hopped up on speed. The backgrounds could be the wallpaper of a daycare. Mario himself, already a tough sell as a compelling protagonist, is fatter and even more adorable than ever. Playing this game feels like a grave violation against adulthood, against my manhood. But that's just appearances, because despite looking and sounding like a one-year-old's used diaper, Super Mario World is an astonishingly rich and deep game that seems to always yield fun new surprises. Super Mario World contains an astonishing more than 72 levels, each one more or less unique, each chock full of secrets to discover. The game's many challenges are so well crafted and fun that playing through is akin to running through a playground. It's a play date with the promise of milk and cookies afterward. The game is so crammed with shit, it's no wonder that Miyamoto-san opted for graphical simplicity, because anything more in your Super Nintendo would have exploded. Sonic the Hedgehog, on the other hand, is an aesthetic masterpiece. Rather than being fat and dopey, the character oozes 90s self-confidence and hip indifference to authority, right at a time when many of us were just starting to hit puberty and watch MTV. Sonic was fast, slick, and like Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam, he probably had a line of girls outside of his hamster hole every night. The graphics in Sonic were equally cool. The deep blue sky, the CGI fish, Sonic's red kicks borrowed from Michael Jackson. The The explosions, all of these little critters bouncing everywhere, the super hot fire, and everybody loves these loop-de-loops in the Green Hill Zone. It looks both retro and futuristic at the same time. The music by Masato Nakamura is a cross between Japanese city pop and New Jack Swing, and it is truly inspired. The main theme from the Green Hill Zone was every bit as original and infectious as the original Super Mario Bros. Theme. But what about the actual gameplay? It's good, but it has some serious flaws. Sonic's greatest strength is its emphasis on speed and super smooth scrolling graphics, but this is also the game's greatest weakness, because in a 2D platformer the player can only see oncoming objects a few inches to the right of Sonic. This means that unless you memorize everything, you'll be spending most of your time accelerating into enemies, walls, dead ends, or other hazards. That's frustrating, and frustration is every video game's greatest enemy, and sadly, Sonic is fraught with frustration. After the brilliant Green Hill Zone is over, Sonic will spend most of his time waiting, or slowly moving from block to block, or chugging through water. It's like starting dinner with an ice cream sundae, and then topping it off with raw broccoli for dessert. The game is a kinda disappointing tease. Try and recapture the thrill of going fast and you're sure to die. In this way, Sonic is the Icarus of video games. For a moment it soars, and then it just crashes into the ocean. That's not to say that Sonic is bad, it's still a pretty good platformer. It's just that it doesn't realize its own potential. Super Mario World, on the other hand, despite looking stupid, turned out to be the best game in 1991 and is easily one of the best games of the 90s. I love Sonic, I love Sega, but the point goes to Nintendo. 1991 was an amazing year in gaming history. It saw the debut of Sonic the Hedgehog, the launch of the Super Nintendo, and the start of the console wars that helped define a generation of gaming. But when it comes to being the king of the Christmas sales season of 1991, there's no doubt in my mind that the one to demand from Santa Claus was none other than the Sega Genesis. The Super Nintendo was great, but Nintendo misread the shifting culture, producing high-quality games oriented towards smaller children and middle-aged casuals. I mean, who else was gonna play Pilot Wings or Sim City? But on top of having the best game library overall that year, the Sega Genesis was also $50 cheaper, a potent combination that explains why the Sega Genesis managed to outsell the Super Nintendo 2-1 that first Christmas sales season. In fact, by January of 1992, the Sega Genesis controlled an astonishing 65% of the video game market, which marked the first time Nintendo was second place in the industry since their debut in the mid-80s. Again, the Super Nintendo was awesome, but it lacked backward compatibility with the NES, cost more money, had fewer games, and a pack-in that left many with a bad first impression. Though some people were impressed. If I had a $300 budget in 1991 and I was buying a console for my kid's Christmas gift, I would have gotten the Sega Genesis with Sonic the Hedgehog, Toe Jam and Earl, Streets of Rage, and Quackshot. Or, if they preferred Nintendo, then for $300, I would have gotten the Super Nintendo console with Super Mario World, F-Zero, and possibly SimCity. You know, for myself. Which console do you all prefer? And which games would you have gotten in 1991? Did you actually get any of these games the Christmas of '91? Let us know in the comments, and thank you very much for watching. We at Creative Cat Productions would like to wish you and your family a happy holiday, regardless of whatever holiday you choose to celebrate. And also, Merry Christmas. Bye-bye now.